morning light spills gently onto center court, filtered through a ribbon of soft, grey clouds that drift above the quiet English sky. Wimbledon wakes, not with noise, but with hush. The dew still clings to the blades of grass like whispered memories. Somewhere in the stands, a seat waits to be filled. Somewhere in the echoes, a story waits to be told. Before the applause, before the trophies, before the long and sculpted shadow stretched across the green, there was only the sound of a ball, rising, falling, rhythmic and lonely, as if searching for meaning in its own flight. Some athletes arrive, like fire consuming the moment, flashing brilliant and loud. Others arrive like mist, slow, unhurried and hard to define. Roger Federer entered the world of sport not with a shout, but a breath. Not as a conqueror, but as something subtler and yet more enduring. He became less a player and more an idea. A mood, a whisper. In a game defined by speed and power, he lingered on court as though time belonged to him, barely touching the ground, brushing away difficulty with the delicacy of a poet turning a final line. His presence didn't demand your attention, it conscripted your reverence through stillness, through grace. This is not a biography made of sharp facts and numbered feats. This is not a catalogue of titles, nor a highlight reel of forehands. This is something quieter. A long breath held in memory's chest. A walk beside him not as a fan marveling from behind glass, but as a curious companion, moving through his journey with bare feet and soft eyes. Tonight, we begin not at the peak, but at the edge of the dream, where stories still taste of snow and brass and the soft ticking of time. In Switzerland, tucked beside the Rhine, there is a city of bridges and watches. That is where our whisper begins. Basel, the city, doesn't shout, it measures. Even its clocks keep time, as if mindful not to disturb the hush. It is old, rooted in routine and precision, wrapped in cool air and cobblestone. It's there, under the sturdy hands of an ordinary Swiss sky, that Roger Federer opened his first chapters. The boy who would one day make tennis look like music was loud as a child. Not loud with voice, but with feeling. Emotion poured through him like uncontained light. Joy when he won, but more often tears, slammed rackets, frustration when he lost. For a game drenched in control, young Roger was a swollen river. He wasn't decorated then. He was disheveled, hair wild, behavior unpredictable. There were those who doubted he could become anything more than a flicker. Talented, yes, but too unruly. They called him emotional, temperamental, unshaped, but something simmered beneath the noise. A rhythm not yet refined. His mother, Lynette, a spirited South African who brought a different flicker of sun into the snowy Swiss world, believed in more than just rules. His father, Robert, Swiss, steady and calm, watched his son's journey with measured hope. Roger was, in every way, a mix of their light and their stillness. Born with warmth, guided by patience. He wasn't the boy who always won, but he was the boy who never stopped watching the ones who did, once. He stood behind the ranks at the Swiss indoors, a ball boy in red and white, delighting in every chance to hand a fresh ball to a player he admired. Polite, eager, eyes wide, not from awe, but from hunger, and early hunger, wrapped in wonder. He dreamed, the way only children can, without irony. A dream where the center court might one day echo his name, where the stadium silence might hush for his serve, where his footsteps might walk beside giants. But, for a long while, they didn't. There were too many smashed rackets, too many implosions. In matches, that he should have won. Coaches leaned in, gently, then sternly. He would need to learn to silence that storm inside, not to bury it, but to shape it, to whisper instead of shout. And slowly the boy began to listen, not just to the coaches, but to himself, to his own breath, to the way a perfect stroke didn't just sound right, but felt like a sigh escaping the soul. Even then, in the solitude of small Swiss courts bordered by pine and mist, something elegant began to move through him. It didn't announce itself. It glimmered faintly, like stars before nightfall. Federer's journey did not begin with gold. It began with green. Not the rich green of Wimbledon lawns, but the modest green of local courts, where a boy with bursting emotion tried to mold his spirit into balance. He was still just a boy, but a boy beginning to hear the hush in the game. A boy inching toward the moment when he would no longer fight against himself, but move with the grace of someone who realized perhaps the game was music, and he, the dancer who hadn't yet heard the full tune. In time, the storm would settle in. Time, emotion wouldn't leave him, it would refine him. And in time, a racket that had once been thrown in anger would become an artist's brush, held between two fingers as if to paint the air with impossibly delicate strokes. But for now, the boy is still growing, still dreaming in Basel, still looking out at a court after everyone else has gone home, with only the sound of wind rustling the trees nearby and the vision of a place across the channel he has never been, but somehow already remembers. That is where we leave him tonight, young Roger, with his emotions, his imperfections, and his daydreams, not yet timeless, not yet graceful, but very much alive. And in that quiet Swiss evening, the first note of a whisper begins. In the soft cradle of the Swiss border, where the Rhine carries its secrets across centuries and rooftops, where snow like old wisdom, a boy was learning the shape of his dreams. Basel carried a quiet pride in its bones, its streets arranged like well-drawn thoughts, its bridges arcing with quiet dignity across the cold river. It was a city that believed in rhythm, not noise, in clocks that never ticked too fast, and days that mirrored each other with comforting fidelity. Here, nothing rushed, not the trams that sighed down cobblestones, not the people who walked beneath the cathedral's quiet bell, and certainly not the boy with wild hair and louder emotions. Roger Federer was not born graceful, not in the way people later described. He did not emerge from silence like a myth already written. As a child, he burned, not like fire too elegant a word, more like flicker unpredictable, full of skips and jumps. He played tennis with reckless magic and tantrums in equal measure. There were days when the court felt sacred, and others when a missed shot sent his racket flying, bouncing as wildly as his emotions. It wasn't anger alone that drove him, it was feeling, unfiltered and full. When he won, you saw the joy before you heard it. When he lost, his tears weren't hidden. They fell openly, heavy on his cheeks and heavier still in his chest. He wasn't ashamed of them yet. At that age, he hadn't learned to smooth out the contours of feeling. He hadn't learned to hide the tempest. His parents observed with a cautious eye. Robert, his father, a man of quiet humor and iron shirts, didn't hover. He offered order, expectation, structure. Lynette, his mother, vibrant and South African in every way Basel was not, seemed to carry the child's spark in her own marrow. She encouraged his spirit, even when it misfired. Between them, he was a bridge discipline sewn to exuberance, patience tied loosely to possibility. Roger tried football too, once. The game danced at his feet, fast, and shared, but it never gave him the solitude he craved. Eventually, he returned to the court, his court, alone but not lonely. The lines beneath his shoes became a sanctuary, a space he didn't yet master, but one that already called to him in a language he was beginning to understand. At 8, they said his serve was suspect. At 10, that he lacked the mental edge. By 12, the whispers changed. Coaches murmured. Now, about the wrist so fluid, they seemed boneless. The precision already forming in shadows. And the way his eyes tracked the ball knot, just watching, but studying. The way an artist watches paint soak into canvas. But none of this calmed the storm. There were tournaments, small ones, in sleepy towns with folding chairs and long shadows. Wins and losses came in equal measure, but it was the losses that stunk the ones he carried home like old burdens, replaying mistake after mistake beneath his breath. Coaching became more than instruction, it became management. There were voices telling him to grow up, to calm down, to play less like a storm and more like a stream. But something inside him resisted. He didn't want to let go of feeling. He didn't want to mute his joy or disguise his pain. And so, he walked that narrow, trembling line between genius and collapse. A boy, hair wild, racket in one hand, anger in the other. He could dazzle and he could disappoint. And on some days, he managed both before the afternoon had ended. There is a photograph, grainy, slightly off-centered, young Roger at the Swiss indoors, standing in the shadows behind the court, red ball boy uniform, crisp, and eyes aiming skyward. He's staring at a player, the name forgotten now, but the posture still speaks. Eagerness sharpened by awe. He wasn't looking at fame, he was looking at possibility. That's when the dream began to stretch. Not just to play, but to belong. Not just to hit, but to glide. Not just to win, but to do so in a way that left the world breathless, if only for a moment. At that age, Federer didn't put words to it, but his body knew. Teenage years are unkind. To perfection, limbs lengthen faster than grace can follow. Serves become erratic. Confidence wavers. Federer's game, once so intuitive now, struggled inside the demands of competition. Local expectations grew louder. Opponents trained just as hard. His father's steady hands remained supportive, but his mother's warmth sometimes clashed with coaches who called for tighter control. And yet there were moments, slice backhands that whistled past stunned opponents, drop shots that felt like silk unraveling over stone. His genius wasn't constant, but when it appeared, it was briefly blinding. Young Roger was beginning to feel the weight of hope. He joined the Swiss National Tennis Center, training far from Basel, far from the safety of home-cooked meals and familiar voices. There, the days lengthened into drills, and drills into frustration. The coaches were neither cruel nor coddling. They asked him to grow up poor, be left behind. And for the first time, Federer's talent alone was not enough. He hated the losing, hated the discipline, even. But slowly, something else was rising. Within him, at night, after silence fell across the dormitory, Roger didn't sleep quickly. He would lie awake, imagining moments, him standing on center court, camera lights flashing, the sound of a gentle cheer, his name carried on grass-scented air, not for glory, but as proof that the thing he felt burning inside had been real all along. That even after all the smashed rackets and thrown towels, the boy who cried at losses and laughed too loudly at Wincy too, could become something lasting, something measured, something still, for even within his chaos, He had always pursued beauty, not just the winning, but the elegance beneath it. A kind of art that could only emerge if he still dared to feel, but at last learned to tame the form of that feeling. And in that, Federer was still becoming, still forming beneath the snowbound sky, inside training rooms thick with breath and chalked at the boy who nearly dissolved in frustration, now sat longer in silence, listened not just to advice, but to the sound of his own heartbeat, steadier now. The racket no longer left his hand in anger. It lingered there, with respect, with intention, and the strokes once forced, now began to whisper. Not often, not yet, but enough to make the coaches lean in and wonder if maybe, just maybe, this wild boy from Basel had finally begun to hear what the game had been singing to him all along. Not a command, a lullaby. There are silences that fall like endings, others fall like beginnings. For Roger, the silence that followed childhood's messinaces was not final. It was the space where something new was stirring, not quieter, but deeper. In the space between impulsive tantrum and artistic restraint, a path was forming, not paved in gold medals or magazine covers, but in questions. Private questions. How far could feeling go, if it was finally held with calm hands? Switzerland had offered him the seed of talent, but now it was time to seek proof of growth. The Swiss National Tennis Center was no sanctuary, no welcoming home. It was stark and demanding, filled with echoing courts and relentless routines. Coaches measured his every move not for magic, but for discipline. Days blurred, wins didn't come easily, and Roger, once so animated on court, began to listen more and explode less. Losing wasn't new, but it hurt differently here. There was no mother to wrap his mistakes in warmth, no home to retreat to, only the mirror of daily effort and the demanding ghost of potential. And yet, within this repetition, something inside Roger began to soften, not weaken, soften, like wood exposed to sun, shaped by wind. The fury didn't leave him, but it changed color, became quieter, denser. The strokes no longer jerked from muscle memory. They began to unroll like verses learned by heart. The footwork, once wild and hopeful, started writing patterns so elegant they almost disappeared into the court. He didn't lose his emotion. He learned not to spill it on every point, not to waste it, not to let it define him. Then, like a thunderclap arriving inside an afternoon nap, Peter Carter, tall, thoughtful, kind. Carter was a former pro with eyes that saw beneath talent. He didn't marvel at Federer's forehand or serve. He studied his still moments, the pause between points, the breath between sets. That's what caught him. Whether Roger could receive instruction, not just give spectacle, and he could dot something about Carter's presence cleared the noise. Roger felt, for once, seen not as a raw nerve, but as a shape still forming. Carter didn't demand miracles, he taught balance, asked that the passion be preserved, not punished, that anger could taper into timing, that brilliance, if aimed with purpose, could last longer than energy uncanny. It was not a radical transformation. No photograph captures the switch. But day by day, Federer became harder to rattle. He still frowned, still lost his temper sometimes, but he apologized afterward, picked up his racket rather than throw it. And in between the familiar stumbles came something precious and rare: control. When Peter Carter died in a car crash in 2002, Roger didn't make a statement. He went quiet, painfully so. Something had gone missing, not just a mentor, but a mirror. And that grief did not become rage, as it once might have. It became direction. That year and the next, a subtle tension hummed beneath Federer's serenity. The cameras didn't catch it, but the players felt it when they played him. The sense that losing was no longer bearable, not for pride, but for promise. That with every point he played not just for himself, but for someone watching from beyond the fence. He did not win to dominate. He won to honor, and with that fire now curved into focus, something astonishing began to bloom. You could see it as early as 2003. The year balance took root, not just in his trophies, but in the way he moved. He didn't hit the ball, he sculpted it. The one-handed backhand, once seen as a liability now, sang in arcs across the court. His return of serve became calculated poetry, deflecting power, with angles that seemed dreamt up by geometry itself. The serve, fluid and ephemeral, relied more on disguise than force. At times it was impossible to predict, until the ball zipped past you like a secret you had no time to keep. When he ran, it was nearly silent, not hurried, not panicked, but as though he already knew where the ball would be and had only come to greet it. Executions followed intention, seamlessly. He didn't grunt, he didn't scream, he danced and let the racket speak. Competitors noticed. Even in warm-ups, they saw how, no matter the surface, he adapted. How his eyes tracked the ball with painter's patience, not predator's hunger. There was no lunge in his game, only glide. And it became clear, slowly, softly, not in one thunderous moment, but many quiet ones, that the boy had become something more. He no longer resisted the wind. He moved with it, still flawed, still human. But something new had arrived in his game. Artistry layered atop muscle, restraint weaving through emotion. A game that lifted spectators without them knowing how. Watching him wasn't a thrill, it was a trance. And perhaps most beautiful of all, he hadn't become this through force. He had stepped into it, learned it, grieved into it, worked his way into it with a kind of meditative discipline that allowed chaos and reflection to rise side by side and dissolve into grace. He had not erased the boy from Basel. He had finally learned how to bring him with him, not as burden, but as beginning. At Wimbledon, the grass doesn't simply grow, it whispers, it remembers. Each blade seems to lean, just slightly, into memory, bowed by footsteps of the past. The echoes of champions linger in the hush that falls before the first serve, carried like dust in unseen light. It is not a loud place, despite the ovations. It is reverent, measured, a ritual more than a tournament. And Roger Federer, when he first stepped onto center court as a young competitor, felt not daunted but called. Wimbledon was never just a goal for him. It was a language he already understood. Something he'd dreamed of, not as a child, marveling at a screen, but like someone who'd once been here in another time, another skin, and had simply returned. A loop, soft with déjà vu. The grass beneath his shoes felt familiar, as though his feet had been shaped for it. The year was 2003. He was 21 then. The noise of early controversy no longer loud behind him, but not yet forgotten. He had shown flashes of brilliance, entombed, sometimes surprising. But Wimbledon, in its quiet elegance, asked something more profound. Not brilliance that burned, graciousness that endured. The path to that first Grand Slam wasn't without weight. The gentle English summer had its thunder's risk of injury, seeded pressure, the ghost shadows of legends. But Roger moved through the draw like a breeze through linen curtains, present, but never insistent. He played with a kind of gentleness that deceived, that tired out opponents used to brute force. And when he lifted the trophy on that July afternoon, the look in his eyes was not conquest, was arrival, not triumphant, but grateful. From there, something clicked into place. Not mechanical, almost spiritual. Wimbledon saw in Federer a kindred spirit, and he, in its patient courts, found a muse. This wasn't just dominance, it was symphony. From 2004 to 2007, he painted those lawns with strokes too smooth for description. His movements seemed to anticipate not only the ball, but the crowd's breath. The record shows wins, yes, but history remembers the glide. He wore white not like tradition, but like truth, like snow fallen perfectly overnight. Somewhere above the scoreboard and below the stands, time slowed when he played. Even his opponents described it as a kind of spell. Among them, Andy Roddick, brave, powerful, human. Roddick met Federer in 3 Wimbledon finals, 3 defeats, each one harder than the last. But in them, there was no humiliation, only contrast. Roddick fought like thunder. Federer answered like rain. One slammed, charged, lunged. The other brushed, curved, arrived. There were moments when Roddick played nearly flawless tennis. And yet, Federer's very essence on grass made perfection insufficient. It wasn't that he won it the way his victories felt foregone, but never arrogant. As though the court had always meant for him to be standing there in the waning light, trophy in hand, shoulders still and smile unfinished. 2009 marked the end of Roddick's long odyssey at Wimbledon, one of the greatest finals ever played. For hours and 16 minutes, 5 sets, emotion without spectacle. When Federer finally won, it was not with explosion, but with an almost apologetic stillness. Roddick had given everything, and Federer, softly, had given something more. Even after his streak of titles ended, the grass never forgot him. He returned again and again. And though others would rise mori on his once home soil, Djokovic, with relentless appetite, Federer, remained the most poetic presence between those green lines. There's a moment, always, in the early rounds, a quieter match. Fewer cameras, less noise. Federer walks onto center court, bag slung high, nodding once to the crowd. No wild gestures, and when the play begins, time folds inward. His serve, smooth as water off stone. The backhand carve, the almost musical split step. Each shot a syllable in a language he somehow invented and refined all at once. The commentators could only sigh. The statisticians could barely keep up. But most of us viewers, silent in homes or seats high above, did not watch to analyze. We watched like one listens to a familiar song. We watched to remember how something can be both human and heavenly. Over the years, center court changed, slightly the roof, the angles, the rules around seeding and scheduling. But Federer on grass, that never did. And so, when he would lose, whether to Nadal, Djokovic, or Timit, never rang as defeat. It sounded instead like a bell tolling softly in the distance, a nod that even beauty must bow gently to impermanence. Yet the memory lingers. No matter how many finals are played or trophies lifted, there's always a spisonmart, unsaid, where Federer still lingers. A curve of shadow during a rally, a hush before a serve, the scent of trimmed grass beneath uncertain skies. For Wimbledon never truly became Federer's kingdom. He became its poetry, unwritten in the rules, but etched in the silence. There is a sunrise that does not promise warmth. It crawls behind the clouds, dragging with it a hush more than a glow, one that feels heavy around the heart. It is in this kind of dawn that shadows come not from the sun behind you, but from the questions beside you. Even elegance is not spared from dusk. For Roger Federer, those shadows began to stretch longer in the years after his Wimbledon peak. Not sudden, but steady, not a fall, just a shift. The light that once followed him without asking began to be shared by a new rhythm. A storm from Malorca. Rafael Nadal. He did not arrive with poetry, he arrived with percussion. Topspin that spun not upward but backward in time, more grindstone than grace, left-handed in movement, right-hearted in will. Where Federer glided, Rafa gripped. Where Roger composed strokes like sentences, Nadal carved arguments into baseline clay. They collided early, and the rhythms clashed. Watching them was like listening to water argue with thunder. At first, Federer was unfazed. Grass was still his song. Hard courts still yielded to his tempo. But as the years wore on, Nadal did not retreat. His presence grew heavier on the court, not just physically, but philosophically. He made Roger labor, made him sweat, made him lose. Clay was where it began in earnest. Roland Garros. From 2005 to 2008, Federer reached the final. 3 times Nadal waited there, and 3 times Roger left, not with silver, but with silence. The dominance that once came easy cracked beneath the weight of Rafa's resilience. Then, in 2008, Wimbledon. That summer had length, rain delays, momentum, swings. The final began in sunlight and ended in twilight. 5 sets stretched like a lifetime folded into 4 hours and 48 minutes. As the match wore on, the center court magic trembled. Federer was defending title, pride, place in history. Nadal, relentless, dragged him into deeper and deeper waters, and the artist struggled to paint. Shots once effortless now seemed strained. The court that knew his name suddenly asked harder questions. Federer fought, yes, noble and brave. But when the final point was played and Nadal fell onto his back in the dusk, it felt not like an upset, but an inheritance. The kingdom had learned to share its crown. In the press room later, Federer, ever composed, offered words. But they were pale copies of what lingered behind his eyes. He had not just lost, he had been seen, vulnerable, beatable, human. Then came Melbourne 2009. Hard court now, new stage, but the pressure had followed. The match dragged into another 5th set, another test of will and belief. Federer unraveled, slowly, inwardly. When it was done, Nadal, victorious again, Roger, went to accept his runner-up trophy, and could not speak. Tears filled his eyes before they reached his voice. He shook his head, struggled. God, he whispered, it's killing me, and it was. Not the defeat itself, but the chasm it revealed, that the body so long a trusted partner could falter, that time once an aliwas, no longer waiting quietly in the wings, and that the dream of eternity can blur when tested by another who refuses to yield. But there is something in Federer's sorrow that deserves more than sympathy. Those tears spoke, not of failure, but of depth, of expectation met with resistance, of love, yes, love for the game itself, and for the version of himself that was just out of reach. He did not quit, he could not, even in loss. Something reawakened, not pride, but purpose, because what Nadal gave Federer, far more than misery, was clarity. The purity of movement had found a counterpoint, and in that dissonance, Federer would learn to play a different kind of symphony, ricocheting between eras, standing, no longer unchallenged, but unyielding, and slowly accepting that greatness is not the absence of struggle, is the grace shown within it. From there, the lines between them softened. They met again and again. Sometimes Federer triumphed, sometimes Nadal did, but what once was tension became something heavier and holier, respect, and later, something deeper still, brotherhood. But in those earliest collisions, something had shifted forever. Federer, once untouchable, now knew the taste of fear, of exhaustion, of walking onto a court and wondering not about outcomes, but about capacity. Could he still summon it? Could he still write poetry when the ink was fighting to run dry? Nadal had made him ask those questions, had stripped him of invincibility, and handed him instead a mirror. And somehow, in learning the edges of his fallibility, Roger began to craft something stronger than dominance, a kind of quiet resilience. He learned to fight not just with skill, but with soul, to hold on not with control, but with care. And though the wins were fewer, they carried more weight, because they came not from the promise of ease, but from the silence of resolve. And in the gentle accumulation of these trials, Federer's myth did not dissolve, it deepened, because some stars don't just burn, they endure. There is a moment in every story when the hero must choose whether to fade or to evolve. For Roger Federer, that moment did not come with drama. No single injury, no sudden loss, no earth-shaking defeat. It arrived slowly, like mist crawling down a mountain, soft but sure. A whisper at first, then a truth. The game was changing, and so was his body. Once youth had clothed him in resistance. Sprains healed overnight, sprints remained silk smooth. But now, each year etched new lines into motion. Each match asked a little more from legs that had once danced with effortless grace. And still, Roger refused to vanish into memory. Instead, he turned his gaze inward, not to reclaim what had been, but to discover what could remain. There is courage in reinvention. Quiet, dignified courage, not of bold declarations, but of steady choices. Federer, once the tireless traveler on the tour, began to choose stillness where once he chose scale. The calendar grew shorter, the priorities clearer, no longer driven by dominance. He became a steward of his own legacy, curating it like a cherished painting, selecting tournaments with care, training with precision, practicing not power, but preservation. He found partners in patience. Stefan Edberg, elegant and stoic, joined his coaching team. Their conversations were less about retooling technique and more about harmonizing it with time. Together, they sculpted a rhythm that honored both Roger's body and his truther style, condensed, efficient, and sustainable. The family box, once peripheral, now held meaning, thicker than medals. Merker, twin daughters, growing sons. The presence of laughter beside the pressure, of bedtime stories after center court battles. Roger was no longer just playing for points, but for presence, for moments extended, for stories that his children could someday witness, not just read. And then came Australia 2017, a year many thought he would not contend. The doubters were not cruel, they were cautious. The knees, they whispered, the age, the new generation. Reality was closing in. Even Federer himself said he entered with low expectations. He had not played in months. He was seeded 17th, But on the court, something unexpected surfaced. Not nostalgia but fluency. The type of skill that sleeps lightly, waiting for the soul to summon it again. He cruised through early rounds, and then to everyone's wonder defeated Tomas Berdych in straight sets. Then Kai Nishikori, then Stan Wawrinka, old rivals, new resolve. And so, as if the past had folded neatly into the present, he met Rafael Nadal in the final dot again. Older now, slower perhaps, but not lesser. Their match was not a reenactment, but an evolution, no longer about rivalry, but reflection. Each point a paragraph, each rally a recollection. The fifth set loomed. Inevitably, Federer was down. 1, 2, 3, and then and only then did time seem to soften. The serves began to sting. The backhander one Nadal once dismantled was swerving. Topspin now stood tall. Shorter strokes, firmer belief. He won 5 games in a row, and with a final forehand clipped just inside the line, he won the match. His 5th Australian Open title, his 18th Grand Slam, and perhaps his most human, because this was not 2003's Federer. This was not the gliding, untouched king of centre court. This was the man who had changed, who had let the pressure mold him, not crush him, who had accepted the erosion of invincibility and answered it with persistence. And when he cried again, it wasn't for loss, it was awe. It was reunion with the game, with himself, with a part of him that had once been impossibly young and now stood impossibly whole. That victory echoed beyond victory. In 2018, he would return and defend his title, would rise, briefly, back to world number 1. But even as the wins continued, there was a shift in gravity. Roger Federer had become something more than a champion. He had become a symbol of longevity, not through resistance to time, but through companionship with it. Tennis slowed for him, not in speed, but in meaning. He no longer raced through matches, he savored them. Points became pages, rallies, chapters, and his fans' millions, scattered across cultures and borders, felt the weight of this articulation. His comebacks were not athletic marvels. They were emotional reunions, proof that beauty could persist not despite hardship, but because of it, that joy could remain not as a reward for domination, but as a companion to imperfection. Older, greyer at the temples, more private in his off-court life, he still lingered in the dreams of stadiums. Children called his name with the same spark their parents once had, and he wavered not as the future, but as the link between all eras the game had known. He no longer needed to prove. He chose instead to illuminate, playing not for legacy, but for light, for the soft reminder that elegance need not gallop, can glide, that genius may age, but it does not expire. It distills until, at last, it stands still, not because it must, but because it has finally found peace. His footsteps had always been quiet. Even at his loudest, Roger Federer never needed to raise his voice to be heard. But now, those footsteps grew softer, still measured with care, cushioned by caution. The knee, once silent in its service, had begun to whisper, and not the kind of whisper that inspires poetry, the kind that drags at the edges of movement, the kind that calls for pause. In 2020, the world slowed, matches cancelled, stadiums emptied, and into that global hush, Federer in defeat, but into recovery. Surgeries, rest, swelling, and stillness. The racket slept in its case longer than ever before, and the world waited not impatiently, but anxiously, wondering if that last twist of the wrist had already come and gone. if the final serve had already struck its mark. But Roger tried. He tried with the same grace he once summoned to take apart giants. He returned to courts that no longer bent so willingly to his will. He competed again and again. In Paris, in Doha, at Roland Garros, at Wimbledon. He walked back onto centre court as though time had curved gently to let him enter once more. A standing ovation lit the stands list for his arrival, and more for the possibility that it might be his last. He played his way to the quarterfinals, riding on echoes and flashes, and then the stumble, the loss. A straight sets defeat. 8 games won across 3 sets. The awe was still there, but the magic flickered, not broken, but dimmed. He walked off court without fanfare, glancing around not at the crowd, but at the grass itself, as if asking the surface for forgiveness, or perhaps gratitude. He wouldn't play there again, not as a competitor. Time had exhaled, and then came the moment, a calendar card no fan wanted to flip. September 2022, the Laver Cup, London's O2 Arena, a tournament he had helped create now. Unexpectedly, the chosen stage for his last bow. He would not play a singles match. The knee could not allow it. But there was still poetry left to write, so he partnered with Rafael Nadal, the rival who had, once upon a clay court, broken his rhythm. Now the brother who sat beside him, they played doubles. Not perfectly, the feet a little slower, the timing mistuned at moments. But the crowd didn't see rust, they saw story. 2 men, once locked in fierce opposition, now rotating in harmony. One serving, the other volleying. One slicing, the others smashing. A final dance, not for dominance, but for memory. They lost the match, but no one noticed, because it was not about the scoreline. It was about the shared breath in the arena, the knowledge that someone was slipping gently into legend. What came next was not part of the script, not rehearsed. Back on the bench, Roger sat with Rafa beside him, hands intertwined, shoulders close. Grown men, aged by time and testimony, and they cried, not performatively, not with restraint. They cried together, the kind of tears that only arrive when the body finally lets go of something it has held so dearly for so long. That moment became larger than any grand slam, larger than the wins, the records, the rivalries. It was the point after all, the points, the quiet after the storm. Federer picked up the microphone. His voice, always soft, trembled now beneath the weight of goodbye. He thanked his team, his parents, his wife, silent presence in every transformation, every comeback, every whispered prayer behind closed doors. And he thanked the game, not just for giving him a life, but for giving him meaning. There were no fireworks, no gold confetti, only floodlights and standing hearts. He placed his racket on the bench, not dropped, but delivered. The applause that followed was unending. It grew and faded, rose again, not from celebration alone, but from something closer, to reverence. For decades, he had made movement look effortless, and now he gave us something greater, the courage to stop, to step away. Not because one must, but because one knows that the music has played its final note, that even the most perfect strokes must still surrender to silence, and still nothing felt lost, because Federer had already given everything, not just the trophies, but his time, his grace, his soul. He hadn't played for attention, for controversy, or domination. He had played to carve beauty into time, And now that time kept him not as a memory, but as a constant in every child who lifts a racket with curiosity, in every fan who remembers the arc of his backhand on a summer's afternoon, in every corner of a court, where the wind sounds just a little like applause waiting to begin again. He was gone now from the draw sheets, from the practice courts, from the schedules, but he had not left the game. He had become part of it, forever written into its silence. There is an emptiness that doesn't echo with Lawsonly, with stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when a story ends so quietly, you almost forget it hasn't always been there. Somewhere, under a pale sky and behind the hush of trimmed hedges, a grass court lies untouched, not abandoned, just at rest. The lines are still marked with care. The net still sags with its gentle weight, but no feet move across it. No shadow falls long and elegant behind a figure poised to serve. The silence is not absence, it is memory. You do not forget someone like Roger Federer. You remember him by accident, in the tilt of a child's shoulders holding a racket for the first time, in the sound of tennis shoes whispering across clay, in a serve struck with nothing but rhythm and graysand, in the sigh that follows, unprompted, from a watching crowd. He did not leave space behind. He left shape, an outline the sport still fills without realizing, because Roger never shouted for attention. He drew it like dusk draws, light inevitably, softly, completely. And now, in his absence, tennis breathes slower for a moment, as if paying its respects in silence before play resumes. His legacy does not sit in numbers. It lives in sensation. He didn't transform tennis with thunder. He rewrote it in whispers. A spin here, a glide there. The almost impossible carried out with such normalcy that you forgot to question whether it could happen. He made illusion and precision the same thing. Made spectators forget that backs could ache, that joints fatigued, that time devours. Because while others fought time, Federer once seemed to nod at it, acknowledging it not as an enemy, but as a partner. And now, time holds him gently. There are matches we remember for their drama, their squeaks, their upset, victories, but Roger's matches, at least, the ones that linger, are remembered differently. Not because of who won, but because of how it felt to watch. The sense that you were in the room with something finer than skill. Something absolute. There's a particular shot Federer, low to the ground, body coiled, and then the one-handed backhand cuts through the air, pure and clean. The ball arcs as if drawn by serene hands, and for a moment the world feels ordered. You didn't need to be a fan to feel it. You only needed a heartbeat. Years will pass, new stars will rise, titles will be broken, records rewritten. But Federer's gift was never confined to triumph. It was present, a calm at the eye of sports. Storm, a steadiness that existed whether the ball landed in or out. He changed the conversation. He made you ask if perhaps sports could do more than dazzle, if they could soothe. And now, in retirement, his presence is quieter still, but not gone. A roar has become a hum, a rally, now a reflection, a match point, now a memory stretched over dinner tables, late-night drives, and children reenacting grace with plastic rackets and wide eyes. There are no reruns of feeling, but every time we return to his matches, something stirs. Not nostalgia, but recognition, as if our better selves once sat beside us, watching someone show what could happen when effort stopped trying to impress and started trying to mean. He taught by moving, by not being louder, but being truer. And now He walks outside the arena. Lights. The shoulders no longer measured for muscle memory, but for children holding tightly to each arm. The eyes that once scanned baseline angles, now watching skies, rivers, lives unlived, while his own unfolded across continents and calendar years. He lived those years fully, not just by playing beautifully, but by never stopping to chase the beauty itself, because a whisper, when given completely, echoes longer than a shout. And still today, that echo lingers in the grass courts of London, in the hard bounce of New York pavement, in the clay-dusted skies of Paris. You cannot place it, you can only feel it. He did not just win matches. He whispered to the game, and long after the final serve has echoed into silence, long after rackets have left his hands, the whisper remains, in the hush between points, in the pause before the serve, in the weightless moment, when the ball rises, spins, exists just before it falls. There he still is, not returning to play, but never quite leaving.